In the quiet town of Millbrook, a estranged daughter was about to uncover a deadly conspiracy. What started as a reluctant homecoming took a shocking turn when she discovered her father's hidden evidence. Gwen Evans wasn't your typical grieving child. For 14 years, she had lived as a forensic accountant, known for exposing financial deceptions others missed. When her dying father whispered, "Trust no one," she had no idea she was walking into danger. Gwen's investigation would lead to discovering her mother's murder was covered up by the town's elite. What began as caring for her terminally ill father would become a fight for justice that would expose Millbrook's darkest secrets forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rental car's engine ticked as it cooled in the driveway of 412 Maple Street, the sound unnaturally loud in the October stillness. Gwen Evans sat behind the wheel, her hands still gripping the leather steering wheel cover she'd bought to make the long drive more bearable. 14 years. 14 years since she'd last seen this house, with its peeling white paint and the crooked mailbox that Bobby had never bothered to fix. The town hadn't changed much. Millbrook still wore its small-town charm like an ill-fitting suit, picturesque on the surface, but with threads of something darker underneath. She'd driven past Henderson's Hardware, still advertising paint on sale since 1987, and Murphy's Diner, where the same faded Coca-Cola sign hung askew in the window. Even the people looked the same, though grayer now, their faces turning to track her progress through town with the predatory interest of those who'd been waiting 14 years for this moment. Mrs. Patterson had been sweeping her front porch when Gwen drove past Oak Street. The old woman had stopped mid-sweep, broom suspended in air, her mouth forming a perfect O of recognition. By the time Gwen reached Maple Street, she'd counted at least 3 curtains twitching in windows, 3 phones likely being lifted to spread the news. Bobby Evans's daughter was back. The girl who'd abandoned her grieving father. The ungrateful child who'd run off to the city and never looked back. She could hear their voices as clearly as if they were speaking in her ear, the same judgmental whispers that had driven her away at 18. Gwen forced her fingers to release the steering wheel and reached for her purse. The house loomed before her, smaller than her memories but somehow more oppressive. The wraparound porch where she'd spent summer afternoons reading sagged slightly on the left side. The garden where her mother had grown prize-winning tomatoes was overgrown with weeds and volunteer maple saplings. A movement in the front window caught her eye. A pale figure retreating into shadow. Bobby. Her father, reduced to watching for her arrival from behind curtains like the neighbors she'd always mocked. The front door opened before she reached it. Dr. Morton stepped out, his medical bag in hand, looking older than his 62 years. His salt and pepper beard had gone fully gray, and new lines mapped his face like a roadmap of worry. "Gwen." His voice carried relief and something else. "Nervousness? You made good time from the city. How is he?" She didn't bother with pleasantries. They'd never been close, though Dr. Morton had delivered her into the world and treated every childhood scrape and fever. The doctor's eyes flickered away from hers. "Weak. The cancers spread faster than we anticipated. I've increased his pain medication, but..." He trailed off, then seemed to gather himself. "He's been asking for you. Constantly. Sometimes he thinks you're still 12 years old." Gwen nodded, though something in Dr. Morton's manner nagged at her. The way he kept glancing over his shoulder at the house. The tension in his shoulders. "How long?" "Days. Maybe a week if we're lucky." He paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "Gwen, I need to ask, has he said anything unusual to you? On the phone, I mean." The question struck her as odd. "Unusual how?" "He's been..." Dr. Morton seemed to choose his words carefully. "The pain medication can cause confusion. Paranoia sometimes. If he says things that don't make sense, things about people in town you shouldn't." "Are you suggesting my father is losing his mind, Dr. Morton?" The sharpness in her voice made him flinch. "Not losing his mind exactly. But terminal patients sometimes develop fixations. Conspiracy theories. It's not uncommon. Conspiracy theories. The phrase sat uneasily in her chest. Bobby had always been suspicious of authority, quick to see hidden motives in the most innocent actions. It was one of the things that had driven her away. His constant warnings about trusting the wrong people, his paranoid scrutiny of her friends and teachers. After her mother's death, it had gotten worse. "I'll keep that in mind," she said finally. Dr. Morton nodded, still looking uncomfortable. "I'll be back tomorrow morning to check on him. Call me if you need anything before then." He hesitated. "It's good that you came, Gwen. Whatever happened between you two, he needs you now." She watched him drive away in his battered Subaru, noting how he kept checking his rearview mirror as if expecting to be followed. Another paranoid resident of Millbrook, she told herself. It must be contagious. The house smelled of medicine and neglect. The hardwood floor she remembered gleaming now lay dull under a film of dust. The family photos that had once lined the hallway were gone, leaving behind pale rectangles on faded wallpaper. Only one picture remained, her high school graduation photo, the one where she'd been trying so hard not to look eager to escape. "Gwen?" The voice from the living room was barely recognizable. Thin, reedy, with an undertone of pain that squeezed her chest. She found him in his recliner, the same ugly brown chair he'd claimed for 30 years. But the man sitting in it bore little resemblance to the Bobby Evans she remembered. Cancer had stolen 50 pounds from his frame, leaving behind sharp angles and hollow cheeks. His once thick black hair had gone white and sparse. Only his eyes remained the same, dark brown, intelligent, and now fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. "You came." His voice cracked with emotion. "I wasn't sure, after all this time." "Of course I came." The words felt inadequate, hollow. She should say more, should bridge the gap of 14 years with something meaningful, but the sight of him so diminished left her speechless. "Sit down." He gestured to the couch across from him, the one that had been her mother's favorite. "Please." She perched on the edge of the cushions, noting how his hands shook as he reached for the water glass on the side table. When had he gotten so frail? The man who'd built houses with his bare hands, who'd once seemed strong enough to hold up the world, now struggled to lift a glass of water. "The business is all settled," she said, falling back on practical matters. "I've arranged for extended leave from work, however long you need." He nodded slowly. "Good. That's good." His eyes darted toward the window, then back to her. "Did anyone follow you? From town?" The question caught her off guard. "Follow me?" "No, of course not. Why would anyone follow me?" "You don't know this town like I do. People watch, people listen. They're always watching." His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair, a nervous habit she remembered from childhood. "Dr. Morton was here. What did he tell you?" "That you're dying." The bluntness of it surprised them both. "That you have days, maybe a week?" Bobby's laugh was bitter. "He tell you I'm crazy too? Going senile? Can't trust anything I say?" The accuracy of his guess sent a chill down her spine. He mentioned that pain medication can cause confusion. Confusion? Bobby leaned forward, his eyes boring into hers. "Gwen, I need you to listen to me. Really listen. There are things about this town, about our family, that you don't know. Things I should have told you years ago." Here it was, the paranoia Dr. Morton had warned her about. She'd seen it before, in the months after her mother's death, when Bobby had become convinced that the accident investigation was inadequate, that the police were hiding something. His obsession had consumed him, driven a wedge between them that eventually became unbridgeable. "Dad? They killed her." The words came out in a whisper, but they hit her like a physical blow. "Your mother. It wasn't an accident." Gwen felt something cold settle in her stomach. "We've been through this," the police investigated. "There was ice on the road. She lost control." "Ice." Bobby's voice dripped with contempt. "There was no ice that night. Temperature never dropped below 40 degrees. I checked the weather reports, I checked everything." But nobody wanted to listen to the grieving widower who was asking too many questions. The old arguments. The same circular conversations that had defined their relationship after Maggie's death. Gwen had been 15, desperate for stability, for someone to help her process her grief. Instead, she'd gotten a father consumed by conspiracy theories, convinced that everyone from the police to the coroner was part of some vast cover-up. "Dad, please. We don't have to do this again." "Do what? Tell the truth?" His voice rose, then broke into a coughing fit that left him gasping. When he could speak again, his tone was quieter but more urgent. "I know how this sounds. I know what they've told you about me. But I'm dying, Gwen. What possible reason would I have to lie to you now?" She wanted to answer him, wanted to explain about grief and guilt, and how the mind creates explanations for tragedies that don't make sense. But something in his expression stopped her. Not the wild desperation she remembered from her teenage years, but a kind of resigned certainty that was somehow worse. A knock at the front door interrupted the moment. Gwen rose to answer it, grateful for the excuse to escape the intensity of Bobby's stare. Emma Harrison stood on the porch, looking exactly like the homecoming queen she'd been 18 years ago. Her blonde hair was shorter now, styled in the kind of effortless bob that took considerable effort to achieve. She wore a pink cardigan over perfectly pressed khakis and carried a casserole dish that smelled like her mother's famous tuna noodle recipe. "Gwen Evans." Emma's smile was warm, practiced. "I heard you were back in town. I'm so sorry about your father." They'd been best friends once, inseparable through elementary and middle school. But high school had driven a wedge between them. Emma's easy popularity, her effortless navigation of small-town social hierarchies, her relationship with Mike Harrison, the boy Gwen had harbored a secret crush on for 2 years. "Emma!" Gwen accepted the casserole dish, noting how Emma's eyes darted past her into the house. "Thank you. This is very kind. How is he?" Emma's voice dropped to the appropriate whisper for discussing the dying. "As well as can be expected." Emma nodded sympathetically. "If there's anything Mike and I can do. I know this must be so hard for you, coming back after all this time. But it's the right thing. Family is everything, especially at the end." There was something in her tone, a slight emphasis on family that made Gwen look at her more closely. Emma's smile never wavered, but her eyes held a sharpness that hadn't been there in high school. "I should let you get back to him," Emma continued. "But please, if you need anything at all, don't hesitate to call. We're in the book. Or better yet, come by for dinner this week. Mike would love to see you again." She was gone before Gwen could respond, clicking down the porch steps in her sensible heels and sliding into a black SUV that looked too expensive for a small-town police detective's salary. "Who was that?" Bobby's voice carried from the living room, sharp with anxiety. "Emma Walsh. Emma Harrison now, I guess." She brought food. Gwen set the casserole on the kitchen counter, noting how the simple act of accepting it felt like crossing some invisible line. When she returned to the living room, Bobby was agitated, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "I told you to stay away from that family." "It's just a casserole, Dad. There's no such thing as just anything with the Harrisons. Mike Harrison was the one who investigated your mother's accident. 22 years old, barely out of the academy, and they put him in charge of the most important case of his career. You think that was coincidence?" The paranoia was back in full force, but something about the way he said it made Gwen pause. Mike had investigated her mother's death? She'd known he'd joined the police force after high school, but she'd never connected him to the accident investigation. He was young, inexperienced. Maybe that's why they chose him. Bobby's eyes were fever bright. A young man who'd do what he was told without asking too many questions. A young man who might be rewarded for his cooperation. Rewarded how? Fast promotions, good assignments, marriage to the prettiest girl in town. Bobby's voice dropped to a whisper. And silence. Above all, silence about what really happened that night. Gwen felt a headache building behind her temples. This was exactly why she'd left Millbrook. The suffocating weight of her father's suspicions, his inability to accept that sometimes terrible things just happened. But as she looked at him now, wasted by disease and consumed by urgency, she couldn't bring herself to shut him down the way she had as a teenager. "What do you think really happened?" she asked quietly. Bobby's eyes widened with surprise, as if he'd expected her to walk away. "I think your mother found out something she wasn't supposed to know. Something about this town, about the people who run it, and I think they killed her to keep her quiet." "About what?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to pain him. "I've spent 20 years trying to figure that out. But I know she was scared in the weeks before she died. She kept getting phone calls that upset her. She started staying late at the town council meetings, asking questions about zoning permits and land deals. She was investigating something. Maggie Evans had been involved in local politics, Gwen remembered. She'd served on various committees, organized fundraisers, fought to preserve the town's historic buildings. It had seemed like harmless civic engagement at the time. "And you think someone killed her for that?" Bobby was quiet for a long moment, his breathing labored. When he spoke again, his voice was distant, as if he were seeing something far away. "She came home that last night looking terrified, said she'd figured it out, said she knew who was behind everything. She was going to make some calls, get the state involved." His eyes refocused on Gwen. She never got the chance. Despite herself, Gwen felt drawn into the story. What happened? She left to drive to her sister's house in the next county, said she needed to think, needed to be away from Millbrook for a few days while she decided what to do. But she never made it there. Bobby's hands clenched into fists. They found her car wrapped around a tree on Route 9, 5 miles outside town. Single car accident, they said. Lost control on a patch of ice that didn't exist. The room fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock that had counted the minutes of Gwen's childhood. She studied her father's face, looking for signs of the delusion Dr. Morton had warned her about. But what she saw instead was pain. The deep, festering wound of a man who'd lost everything and spent 2 decades trying to understand why. "Dad," she said gently, "even if you're right, even if there was something suspicious about Mom's death, what could you possibly do about it now? It's been 20 years. I can tell you." His voice was urgent again. "I can pass on what I've learned, what I've figured out. I can make sure that when I'm gone, someone knows the truth." "What truth? You just said you don't know what she discovered." Bobby leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "No. But I know who killed her." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gwen felt her analytical mind rebelling against the conversation, demanding evidence, proof, logical explanations. But another part of her, the part that had loved and trusted this man before grief and paranoia had twisted him, wanted to believe that his 20-year obsession might have been justified. "Who?" she whispered. But Bobby's eyes had closed, his breathing becoming deep and regular. The pain medication was winning again, pulling him under before he could answer the question that might explain everything. Gwen sat in the growing darkness, watching her father sleep and trying to process what he'd told her. Outside, the street lights were coming on, casting long shadows across the yard where she'd played as a child. The house settled around her with familiar creaks and sighs, but it no longer felt like home. It felt like a place where secrets lived in the walls, where 20 years of unanswered questions had taken root like weeds. She thought about Emma's visit, about the slight edge to her smile, and the expensive SUV that suggested the Harrison family was doing very well for themselves. She thought about Dr. Morton's nervous manner and his warnings about Bobby's mental state. She thought about Mike Harrison, 22 years old and investigating the death of a woman who might have uncovered something worth killing for. Most of all, she thought about her mother, vibrant, passionate Maggie Evans, who'd fought for causes she believed in and asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Had she really stumbled onto something dangerous? Or was this all the elaborate fantasy of a grieving man who couldn't accept that sometimes good people died for no reason at all? Bobby stirred in his sleep, mumbling words she couldn't quite catch. But one phrase came through clearly, spoken with such venom that it made her skin crawl. "What they did to Maggie." Gwen pulled a blanket over her father's wasted form and went to the kitchen to put Emma's casserole in the refrigerator. As she moved through the dark house, she found herself checking the locks on the doors and testing the windows. Actions that would have seemed paranoid just hours ago, but now felt like simple prudence. 20 years of questions were pressing against her consciousness, demanding answers she didn't have. But as she settled into the uncomfortable vigil of caring for a dying parent, one thought echoed in her mind with uncomfortable persistence. What if he was right? Bobby's hand tightened on the armrest as consciousness pulled him back from the morphine-dulled edges of sleep. 3 days had passed since Gwen's arrival. 3 days of watching her move through the house like a ghost, cleaning corners that hadn't seen attention in years, organizing pill bottles with the methodical precision that had made her successful in the city. But he could see the questions building behind her eyes, the way she studied him when she thought he wasn't looking. "You're awake." Gwen appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea, steam curling from the surface like morning mist. The sight of her there, silhouetted against the hallway light, sent a jolt through his chest. For a moment, she looked exactly like Maggie at 32, the same determined set to her shoulders, the same intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Can't seem to stay under for long anymore. His voice came out as a rasp. The cancer was eating away at everything now, including his ability to speak clearly. "Sit with me." She settled into the chair she'd claimed as her own, the one that gave her a clear view of both him and the front window, always watching the angles. His Gwen. It was a trait that would serve her well in the days to come, though he prayed she'd never need to use it. "Dr. Morton will be here soon for your afternoon check." She spoke carefully, the way people did around the dying, as if normal conversation might hasten the inevitable. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Bobby's jaw clenched. Morton. The name tasted bitter in his mouth. How long has he been asking questions? About what I say to you? Gwen's cup paused halfway to her lips. He's concerned about the pain medication affecting your mental clarity. Mental clarity? Bobby laughed, but it turned into a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his handkerchief. When he could speak again, his voice was urgent. "Gwen, there's something I need to show you. In my study. There's a..." The sound of tires on gravel cut through his words. Through the front window, they watched Dr. Morton's Subaru pull into the driveway, 10 minutes early for his scheduled visit. Bobby's eyes met Gwen's, and she saw something there that made her stomach clench. Not confusion or medication-induced paranoia, but sharp, clear fear. "Later," he whispered. "We'll talk later." Dr. Morton entered with his usual professional bustle, medical bag in hand, and that nervous energy that seemed to follow him everywhere. But today, there was something different in his manner, a heightened alertness that set Gwen's instincts on edge. "Good afternoon, Bobby. How are we feeling today?" Morton's voice carried forced cheerfulness as he pulled out his stethoscope. "Like I'm dying," Bobby replied flatly. "Same as yesterday." Morton's smile flickered. "Let's have a listen to your chest." As he leaned over Bobby with the stethoscope, his voice dropped to a murmur that barely carried to where Gwen sat. "Have you been talking? About the past?" Bobby's eyes found Gwen's over the doctor's shoulder. "Just reminiscing with my daughter. Nothing important." "Good. That's good." Morton straightened, checking Bobby's pulse with hands that weren't quite steady. "The important thing now is comfort. Peace. No need to dwell on old troubles." The way he said old troubles made Gwen's forensic accounting instincts prickle. It was the same tone clients used when they were trying to steer her away from certain financial records, casual dismissal masking deeper anxiety. "Is there something specific you're concerned about, Dr. Morton?" she asked. The doctor's eyes snapped to hers, and for just a moment she saw something that looked like guilt. "Concerned?" "No, not concerned. Just terminal patients sometimes become fixated on past events. They can develop elaborate theories about things that happened years ago. It's better for everyone if those theories aren't taken too seriously." "Everyone?" Gwen's voice sharpened. Who else would be affected by my father's memories? Dr. Morton busied himself packing his medical bag, not meeting her eyes. Figure of speech? I just meant it's better for the patient's peace of mind. He turned back to Bobby. I'm adjusting your pain medication again. This should help you rest more comfortably. After Morton left, Bobby was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the street where he'd lived for 30 years. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Gwen lean forward. Do you remember the night your mother died? The question hit her like a physical blow. She'd spent years in therapy learning to live with that memory. The phone call from the police, the surreal drive to the hospital, the moment when everything that mattered was suddenly gone. Of course I remember. Do you remember what I was like? In the weeks after? Gwen nodded slowly. You were obsessed. You couldn't accept that it was an accident. You kept saying the investigation was incomplete, that they'd missed something important. I wasn't obsessed. I was terrified. Bobby's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. Terrified that they'd killed her because of what she'd discovered, and terrified that if I pushed too hard, they'd kill me too. Or worse, they'd kill you. The room seemed to shrink around them. Dad, that's why I let you go. His voice broke. When you turned 18 and said you wanted to leave for college, I didn't fight it. I should have, but I was so afraid that staying close to me would put you in danger. I thought if you were gone, if you clearly wanted nothing to do with me or this town, they'd leave you alone. 14 years of resentment shifted in Gwen's chest, rearranging themselves into something more complex. You wanted me to leave? I wanted you safe. But I never stopped investigating. I never stopped looking for proof of what they did to her. Bobby's eyes fixed on hers with desperate intensity. And I found it, Gwen. I found enough to destroy them all. Before she could respond, another car pulled into the driveway. Through the window, Gwen saw a familiar figure climbing out of a patrol car. Mike Harrison, looking every inch the successful small-town detective in his pressed uniform and polished badge. He'd filled out since high school, his boyish features now carrying the authority that came with 15 years of law enforcement. Bobby's entire body tensed. He's early. They usually wait until evening. They? Mike's been checking on me regularly since the diagnosis. Official welfare visits, he calls them. Always asking if I need anything, if I'm comfortable, if I'm talking to anyone about old times. Mike's knock was firm but not aggressive. The practiced rap of someone who understood the psychology of intimidation. Gwen went to answer it, acutely aware of Bobby's eyes tracking her movement. Gwen Evans. Mike's smile was warm, genuine, with just a hint of the charm that had made him irresistible to teenage girls. I heard you were back in town. I'm sorry about your father. Thank you. She studied his face, looking for signs of the young man she'd once harbored secret feelings for. He was there, buried under years of professional composure, but something else lurked behind his eyes, a calculation that hadn't been there in high school. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I've been keeping an eye on Bobby since he got sick. Small town, you know. We look out for each other. That's very kind of you. Mike's gaze moved past her into the house. How's he doing today? Some days he's very talkative. Others, the medication keeps him pretty quiet. The emphasis on talkative wasn't lost on her. He has good days and bad days. I imagine he's told you some interesting stories. Bobby's always had a vivid imagination, especially about the past. Mike's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. I hope you're not letting his theories upset you. Terminal illness can really affect a person's perspective on events. There it was again, the casual dismissal, the suggestion that Bobby's memories couldn't be trusted. But coming from Mike, it felt more like a warning than medical advice. What kind of theories? She asked. Mike's smile didn't waver, but something shifted in his expression. Oh, you know. Old grievances. Things that happened years ago that maybe didn't happen quite the way he remembers them. From the living room, Bobby's voice called out, stronger than it had been in days. Mike Harrison. Come to check on the crazy old man? Mike stepped inside, his demeanor changing subtly as he entered Bobby's domain. The easy confidence remained, but there was a wariness now, like a cat approaching a wounded animal that might still have claws. Bobby, you're looking better. I'm dying. How much better can I look? Bobby's dark eyes fixed on the detective. But my mind's still sharp. Sharp enough to remember things some people would prefer forgotten. The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees. Gwen found herself standing between the two men, feeling the weight of currents she didn't understand flowing around her. Nobody wants you to forget anything important, Bobby, Mike said carefully. But sometimes, when we're facing the end, we can get confused about what's real and what's wishful thinking. Wishful thinking. Bobby's laugh was harsh. You think I wished for 20 years of knowing my wife was murdered? You think I enjoyed lying awake every night wondering if her killers were walking free in my own town? Mike's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Bobby, we've been through this. Maggie's death was investigated thoroughly. It was an accident. By you. A 22-year-old rookie who'd never worked a suspicious death in his life. By the department. I wasn't alone on that case. No, you weren't. Bobby leaned forward in his chair. You had plenty of guidance from people who wanted it wrapped up quickly and quietly. Gwen watched this exchange with growing unease. The subtext was clear. These two men had had this conversation before, probably many times over the years. But there was something different about it now. A finality that suggested this might be their last chance to settle old scores. Mike glanced at Gwen, seeming to remember her presence. I should go. Let you folks have your time together. He moved toward the door, then paused. Gwen, if you need anything while you're in town, anything at all, don't hesitate to call. You have my number. She hadn't given him her number, but that was small-town life. Everyone knew how to reach everyone else when they needed to. After Mike left, Bobby slumped back in his chair, the brief surge of energy spent. But his eyes remained alert, following Gwen as she moved to the window to watch the patrol car disappear down Maple Street. Now do you see? He asked quietly. See what? How they watch, how they listen, how they remind us, that some things are better left buried. Bobby's voice grew urgent again. But I'm dying, Gwen. I don't have anything left to lose. And there are things you need to know before I'm gone. Quote, about Mom? About everything. About who she really was, what she discovered, and why they had to silence her. Bobby struggled to sit up straighter. In my study, behind the bookshelf with my construction manuals, there's a loose board. Inside, his words were cut off by another coughing fit, this one more violent than before. Blood spattered his handkerchief, bright red against the white fabric. When it passed, he was gasping, his skin gray with exhaustion. Dad, you need to rest. No time for rest. But even as he said it, his eyes were closing, the medication and his body's weakness pulling him under. Tomorrow I'll show you everything. But tomorrow wouldn't come. That night, as October wind rattled the windows and sent dead leaves skittering across the porch, Bobby Evans fought his final battle with the cancer that had been eating him alive for months. Gwen dozed fitfully in the chair beside his bed, waking periodically to check his breathing, to adjust his blankets, to hold his hand when nightmares made him restless. At 3:47 a.m. he jerked awake with startling suddenness, his eyes wide and lucid despite the morphine flowing through his system. His hand shot out and grabbed Gwen's wrist with surprising strength. Gwen. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the urgency of a dying man's last confession. Listen to me. Trust no one. No one in this town. They're all. His grip loosened, his eyes lost their focus. And with a final, shuddering breath, Bobby Evans took his secrets to the grave. But not all of them. The funeral had been a study in small-town theater. Half of Millbrook turned out to pay their respects to Bobby Evans, filling the pews of St. Mark's with faces that carried the appropriate mixture of sympathy and relief. Judge Patricia Whitmore had delivered a moving eulogy about Bobby's contributions to the community, his skill as a craftsman, his dedication as a father. She'd made no mention of his 20-year obsession with his wife's death. Now, 3 days later, the house on Maple Street stood empty, except for Gwen and the weight of her father's final words. Trust no one. The phrase echoed in her mind as she moved through rooms that felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, sorting through the debris of a life cut short by both cancer and secrets. She'd started with the obvious places: desk drawers, filing cabinets, the shoebox of important papers most people kept in their closets. Bobby's records were meticulously organized, a reflection of his construction background, where precise measurements meant the difference between success and catastrophe. Bank statements, insurance policies, tax returns, all accounted for and filed with military precision. But there were gaps, unexplained withdrawals, regular payments to something called Investigative Services LLC that stretched back 15 years, cash transactions with no documentation. For someone whose business dealings were otherwise transparent, Bobby had been maintaining a remarkably opaque parallel financial life. Gwen's forensic accounting training kicked in automatically. Follow the money. Always follow the money. People could lie with words, but financial records told their own truth. The study felt different in the afternoon light filtering through Bobby's old curtains. This had been his sanctuary, the room where he'd retreated after long days of construction work, where he'd taught her to balance checkbooks and understand blueprints. The walls were lined with technical manuals, construction guides, electrical codes, plumbing handbooks that had helped him build his business from nothing. Behind the bookshelf with his construction manuals, his words came back to her with sudden clarity. She'd been so focused on his final warning that she'd nearly forgotten his earlier attempt to share something important, something hidden. The bookshelf was heavy, solid oak that Bobby had built himself during their first year in the house. Gwen ran her hands along its edges, looking for anything unusual. The shelves were packed tight, with manuals arranged by subject and date, creating a wall of technical knowledge that had been Bobby's professional Bible. She started pulling books, checking behind each row for hidden compartments or loose boards. The process was methodical, systematic, the same approach she used when auditing companies suspected of financial irregularities. Look for anomalies, question assumptions. Trust nothing until it's verified. The third shelf yielded the first clue. A section of manuals about foundation work shifted slightly when she pressed against them, revealing a gap between the bookshelf and the wall. Her heart rate picked up as she worked the entire shelf away from the wall, muscles straining against weight that seemed designed to discourage casual investigation. Behind the shelf, a section of the wall's baseboard hung loose. The wood had been carefully cut and replaced so that it looked normal from a distance but could be removed with minimal effort. Bobby's craftsmanship, applied to concealment rather than construction. Inside the hidden space was a metal strongbox, the kind used to protect important documents from fire. It was secured with a combination lock, but Gwen knew her father well enough to guess his approach to security. He'd always favored the practical over the clever, dates that mattered, numbers that had meaning. Her mother's birthday worked on the first try. The contents of the box transformed her understanding of everything she'd believed about her father's mental state. This wasn't the collection of a paranoid man constructing elaborate fantasies. This was the methodical documentation of a trained investigator, which, she realized with growing shock, was exactly what Bobby had become. The first folder contained photographs. Crime scene photos of her mother's accident, but not the sanitized versions that had appeared in the newspaper. These showed details that raised immediate questions. Tire marks that didn't match the official accident report. Damage patterns on Maggie's car that suggested impact from multiple directions. Skid marks that indicated someone had attempted to brake hard well before the supposed point where she'd lost control. More disturbing were the comparison photos. Pictures of the accident scene taken at different times, showing how evidence had been altered or removed between the initial investigation and the final report. Someone had been very careful to ensure that certain details disappeared from the official record. The second folder contained audio recordings, hours of phone conversations, secretly recorded using equipment that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain in the early 2000s. Gwen plugged in the ancient tape player Bobby had left with the box and heard voices she recognized. Drive, Morton, Judge Whitmore, even Mike Harrison, discussing the Evans problem with the clinical detachment of people arranging a business transaction. The investigation needs to be wrapped up quickly. Judge Whitmore's younger voice crackled through the old speakers. Bobby's asking too many questions, and if he keeps pushing, others might start wondering what he's found. Morton's handling the medical side. Mike's voice responded. The toxicology report will show what we need it to show. And the accident reconstruction? Already complete. Single car accident, driver error due to weather conditions. Case closed. Gwen felt sick. Her mother's death hadn't just been murder. It had been murder followed by a systematic cover-up involving some of the most respected people in Millbrook. The third folder contained Bobby's own investigation notes, written in his careful handwriting and organized with the same precision he'd applied to construction projects. Timeline of events leading up to Maggie's death. Lists of people she'd spoken with in her final weeks. Copies of documents related to a proposed development project that would have transformed a significant portion of Millbrook's historic downtown into a shopping complex. The proposed developer was a company called Whitmore Holdings. Pattern recognition clicked in Gwen's trained mind. Judge Patricia Whitmore hadn't just been covering up a crime, she'd been protecting a financial interest worth millions of dollars. Maggie Evans, with her involvement in historic preservation and town planning, had been asking the right questions about permits, environmental impact, and financial backing. She'd been getting too close to discovering that the judge was using her position to fast-track a development project that would personally enrich her, while destroying the town's character. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to Gwen in Bobby's handwriting. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. My dearest daughter, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and you've found what I spent 20 years collecting. I pray you never have to see this evidence, but if something happens to me before I can expose the truth, then the burden falls to you. Your mother was murdered because she discovered that Judge Whitmore was planning to destroy the historic district for personal profit. The development project would have required falsifying environmental reports and bribing state officials. Maggie had uncovered evidence of both, and she was planning to take it to the Attorney General. They killed her to protect not just one development deal, but an entire network of corruption that reaches into every level of government in this county. Dr. Morton falsified her autopsy. Mike Harrison buried evidence from the scene. Judge Whitmore orchestrated it all. I've spent 20 years documenting their crimes, but I've also spent 20 years being too afraid to act. They've made it clear what happens to people who threaten them. I chose my life over justice for your mother, and I'll carry that shame to my grave. Don't make my mistake, Gwen. But don't be foolish either. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again. If you decide to pursue this, trust no one in Millbrook. Everyone who matters is either part of the conspiracy or too frightened to oppose it. I love you. I've always loved you. I let you hate me because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't fight for your mother's memory. Maybe that was wrong, but I wanted you to have a life free from this poison. Whatever you decide to do with this information, know that your mother would be proud of the woman you've become. Your father, Robert Evans Gwen, sat on the floor of Bobby's study, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that had shaped her entire life. Her father hadn't been paranoid. He'd been terrified. Not delusional, but methodical. Not obsessed with fantasies, but haunted by truths too dangerous to speak aloud. The forensic accountant in her was already cataloging the evidence, assessing its strength, considering how to verify and expand the documentation. But the daughter in her was reeling from the revelation that every assumption she'd made about her father's behavior had been wrong. Bobby Evans hadn't been driven mad by grief. He'd been driven underground by a conspiracy that had murdered his wife and threatened his child. For 20 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that justice was impossible because the very people responsible for dispensing it were the ones who'd committed the crime. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the study floor, Gwen faced the choice her father had described in his letter. She could pack the evidence away, sell the house, and return to her safe life in the city. Let the dead bury the dead, as her therapist might say. Or she could finish what Bobby had started, knowing that the same people who'd killed her mother were still in power, still dangerous, and still very much interested in keeping their secrets buried. Outside, A car drove slowly past the house, too slowly for someone simply passing through the neighborhood. The paranoia that had consumed her father was beginning to make perfect sense. In Millbrook, the watchers were always watching. Gwen stared at her phone, Mike Harrison's contact card glowing on the screen. 3 days since finding Bobby's evidence, and she couldn't shake the feeling that isolation would be her downfall. She needed allies, or at least to identify her enemies with certainty. The coffee shop on Main Street buzzed with morning activity when Mike arrived, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. His smile carried the same warmth she remembered, but now she knew what lurked beneath it. "Thanks for meeting me," she said carefully. "I need help understanding some things about Dad's final years." Mike's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. What kind of things?" The coffee shop conversation had been a masterclass in deception. Mike's answers about her mother's investigation contained subtle contradictions that aligned perfectly with Bobby's evidence. Now, 2 days later, Gwen knew she was being watched. Her house had been searched. Nothing taken, but drawers slightly askew, papers disturbed. The message was clear. They knew she was asking questions. Judge Whitmore's unexpected visit confirmed it. The elegant woman sat in Bobby's old chair, her presence filling the room with quiet menace. "Your father was a troubled man," Whitmore said smoothly. "I'd hate to see you inherit his obsessions." Judge Whitmore's visit had been a turning point. The elegant threat delivered in Bobby's living room made one thing crystal clear. Gwen was no longer just Bobby Evans's grieving daughter. She was a problem that required management. That night, as she sat in the darkness of her childhood bedroom, reviewing her father's evidence for the 100th time, a soft tapping at the back door made her freeze. 3 gentle raps, pause, 2 more, a pattern that seemed deliberate rather than random. Through the kitchen window, she could make out a hunched figure on the back porch. Tommy Walsh stood in the shadows, swaying slightly in a way that suggested either intoxication or deliberate performance. But his eyes, when they met hers through the glass, were sharp and completely sober. "We need to talk," he said quietly when she opened the door. "But not here. Too many ears in this neighborhood." Gwen studied him carefully. Tommy Walsh had been 2 years ahead of her in school. Emma's older brother who'd been destined for greatness until the accident that had supposedly left him brain-damaged and harmless. The town drunk who stumbled through odd jobs and lived on disability checks, the object of everyone's pity and no one's suspicion. "The old Miller barn," Tommy continued. 20 minutes. Come alone, but bring your father's box." He was gone before she could respond, melting back into the darkness with surprising stealth for someone who was supposed to be mentally impaired. The Miller barn sat on the edge of town, abandoned since old Henry Miller had died 5 years earlier. Gwen approached it carefully, Bobby's evidence box tucked under her arm, every instinct screaming that this was either salvation or a trap. The forensic accountant in her had analyzed the risks, meeting a potentially unstable man in an isolated location with evidence that people had killed to protect. But Tommy Walsh was the first person in Millbrook who'd approached her instead of the other way around. In a town where everyone seemed to be playing elaborate games of misdirection, that felt significant. She found him inside the barn, sitting on a hay bale with a battery-powered lantern casting eerie shadows across the walls. Up close, without his public performance of disability, Tommy looked different. His posture was straighter, his eyes focused and intelligent. The transformation was startling. "You can drop the act," she said carefully. Tommy's laugh was bitter. Which act? The drunk? The brain-damaged victim? Or the harmless fool that everyone ignores? He gestured for her to sit on a nearby bale. "I've been performing so long, sometimes I forget which one is real." "How long have you been aware?" "Since about 6 months after the accident. Turns out severe brain trauma doesn't always mean permanent damage. But by then, everyone had written me off as harmless. I realized that being invisible had certain advantages in a town full of secrets." Gwen set the evidence box between them. "What do you know about my mother's death?" "Everything." Tommy's voice carried 20 years of suppressed rage. "I was there that night. Not at the accident site. at the meeting where they planned it. The words hit her like a physical blow. You witnessed them planning her murder? Judge Whitmore's private office, 2 nights before your mother died. I was doing maintenance work in the courthouse, one of my odd jobs that people think I'm too stupid to understand. They didn't know I was there, cleaning the offices after hours. Tommy's hands clenched into fists. Whitmore, Dr. Morton, Mike Harrison, and 2 men I didn't recognize. State-level people, by their clothes and the way they talked. What did they say? Maggie Evans had copies of documents proving the environmental impact reports for the development project were falsified. She'd also uncovered financial records showing bribes to state officials. Whitmore said she was planning to take everything to the Attorney General's office in the state capitol. Gwen felt sick. Her mother had been so close to exposing the entire conspiracy. They discussed options, Tommy continued, discrediting her, buying her off, legal intimidation. But Maggie was too clean, too respected, too determined. That's when Dr. Morton suggested the accident option. You heard them plan it? I heard Morton explain how certain drugs could cause disorientation and poor judgment while being virtually undetectable in a standard autopsy. I heard Mike Harrison describe the perfect location on Route 9 where a single car accident would look completely believable. I heard Judge Whitmore approve the operation. Why didn't you come forward? Tommy's laugh was hollow. Come forward as what? The brain-damaged drunk who claimed to overhear a murder conspiracy? They would have had me committed or killed me outright. So I played dead, mentally dead, and I waited. Waited for what? For someone with the skills and resources to do something about it. Your father was close, but he was too afraid. He knew they were watching him, knew that one wrong move would cost him his life. Tommy leaned forward. But you're different. You have connections outside Millbrook, expertise they can't easily dismiss, and now you have the evidence to back up the accusations. Gwen processed this revelation. Tommy Walsh hadn't been the town's harmless drunk. He'd been its secret witness, playing a 20-year role while waiting for the right moment to emerge. I've been collecting my own evidence, Tommy continued, producing a worn duffel bag from behind his hay bale. Photographs, recordings, documents I've acquired over the years. Things that complement what your father gathered. Inside the bag was a treasure trove of information. Photos of clandestine meetings, recordings of conversations between conspirators, financial documents showing money trails that connected local corruption to state-level officials. Tommy had been busy during his years of invisibility. There's more, he said. I know who the state contacts are. I know about other development projects, other people who've been silenced. Your mother's murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern going back decades. How many people? At least 6 suspicious deaths over the past 20 years. All people who were asking inconvenient questions about land deals, environmental violations, or financial irregularities. All ruled accidental or natural causes by Dr. Morton. The scope of it was staggering. Millbrook wasn't just hiding one murder, it was hiding a systematic campaign of murder designed to protect a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of state government. Why now? Gwen asked. Why reveal yourself to me now? Tommy's expression darkened. Because they're planning to kill you. After Judge Whitmore's visit yesterday, there was an emergency meeting. They've decided you know too much to be allowed to leave Millbrook alive. Fear hit her like ice water. When? Soon. They're still debating methods. Another accident versus something that looks like suicide brought on by grief over your father's death. But the decision's been made. Gwen stared at the evidence surrounding them, her father's methodical documentation, Tommy's covert intelligence gathering, proof of decades of systematic murder and corruption. It was enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, but only if she lived long enough to get it to the right people. There's something else, Tommy said quietly. Dr. Morton's conscience is finally getting to him. 30 years of covering up murders is taking its toll. He's been drinking heavily, talking about confessing. I think we might be able to turn him. How? He's been treating me for years. Knows I'm not as damaged as I pretend. If we approach him right, offer him protection in exchange for testimony, he might break. A confession from the medical examiner who falsified all those death certificates would be the nail in their coffin. Gwen felt something she hadn't experienced since finding Bobby's evidence: hope. For the first time, she wasn't alone in this fight. She had an ally who understood the stakes, who'd been preparing for this moment for 20 years. "What do you propose?" Tommy smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. "We finish what your parents started. We expose them all. But first, we keep you alive long enough to see justice done." Outside the barn, the wind picked up, rattling the old wooden structure. Somewhere in Millbrook, powerful people were planning her death with the same cold calculation they'd used to murder her mother. But now she had something Bobby had never possessed: a partner who understood the game and knew how to play it. The war for truth was about to begin. Dr. Morton's hands shook as he poured his third whiskey of the morning. The medical office that had once been his pride, diplomas arranged precisely on oak-paneled walls, medical journals stacked with military precision, now felt like a mausoleum of compromised ethics. 30 years of healing had been overshadowed by 30 years of covering up murder. The knock on his private office door came at exactly 9 a.m., just as Tommy had predicted. Morton looked up to see Gwen Evans standing in his doorway, no longer the grieving daughter but someone who carried herself with dangerous purpose. "We need to talk, Dr. Morton. About my mother. About all of them." His whiskey glass slipped from nerveless fingers, amber liquid spreading across the case files scattered on his desk. "Gwen, Your father's funeral was lovely. If you need grief counseling, I can recommend—" "I know." The words cut through his stammering like a blade. "I know about the falsified death certificates. I know about the murders you've been covering up for decades. I know about the meeting where you suggested drugging my mother." Morton's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Tommy Walsh was there, in the courthouse that night 20 years ago, cleaning offices while you and Judge Whitmore planned my mother's murder. Gwen stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "He heard everything." The doctor sank into his chair as if his bones had turned to water. "Tommy Walsh is brain damaged. Has been since his accident. Nobody would believe the man who's been playing drunk and damaged for 20 years while documenting your crimes." Gwen pulled out her phone, showing him a photo of Tommy's evidence cache. "The man who has recordings of your voice discussing which drugs would cause disorientation without showing up in a standard autopsy?" Morton stared at the phone screen, his professional composure crumbling. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. The development project wasn't just about money, it was about the town's survival. Millbrook was dying economically. The Whitmore development would have brought jobs, revenue, a future. So you decided to murder anyone who stood in the way? It wasn't supposed to be murder." The words burst out of him with 20 years of suppressed guilt. The plan was to discredit her, make her seem unstable. But Maggie was too smart, too respected. She had copies of everything: financial records, environmental reports, correspondence with state officials. She was going to destroy us all. Gwen felt a cold satisfaction. He was breaking, just as Tommy had predicted. 30 years of carrying the weight of systematic murder was finally crushing the man who'd once taken an oath to do no harm. "Tell me about the drug," she said quietly. Morton's hands trembled as he reached for the bottle again. "Ketamine. Injectable. Fast-acting. In the right dose, it causes disorientation, poor judgment, loss of motor control. Perfect for staging an accident." His voice dropped to a whisper. "It metabolizes quickly. By the time the autopsy was performed, there was barely a trace." "But you found traces. Microscopic amounts. Nothing that would raise questions in a routine toxicology screen, especially if the examining physician wasn't looking for it." Morton's laugh was bitter. "I wasn't looking for it because I already knew what I'd find." "How many others?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Morton poured another whiskey, his hands steadier now that the truth was finally bleeding out of him. 6 confirmed, maybe more that I wasn't directly involved with." His voice was matter-of-fact now, as if he were discussing a particularly challenging diagnosis. Henry Miller when he refused to sell his farm for expansion of the development project. Sarah Chen when she started investigating irregularities in the town's environmental permits. David Rodriguez when he discovered the judge was taking bribes from contractors. Each name hit Gwen like a physical blow. These weren't statistics. They were real people whose deaths had been carefully orchestrated to protect the conspiracy. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you go along with it?" Morton looked up at her with eyes that held 30 years of accumulated shame. "Because I was weak. Because Judge Whitmore made it clear what happened to people who didn't cooperate. Because after the first one, I was too deep to ever get out." "The first one? My wife." The words came out barely above a whisper. "Linda, 25 years ago, she found out about the falsified death certificates, threatened to report me to the state medical board." Morton's face cracked. "Whitmore said it would look like suicide. A depressed woman who couldn't handle her husband's drinking problem. I thought if I just went along, it would end there." The room spun around Gwen. Dr. Morton had been living with the knowledge that he'd enabled his own wife's murder for a quarter century. "But it never ends, does it?" Morton continued. "Once you cross that line, there's always another problem that needs solving. Another person asking inconvenient questions. You become part of the machine." "It can end now," Gwen said carefully. "You can make it end." Morton laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You think confession will set me free? You think testimony will wash the blood off my hands?" He gestured around his office. "I've spent 30 years healing people while helping to murder others. There's no redemption for that. There's justice. For my mother, for your wife, for all the others. Justice." Morton tasted the word like poison. What justice is there for a man who betrayed everything he claimed to believe in? Before Gwen could answer, the office door burst open. Mike Harrison stood in the entrance, his hand resting on his service weapon, his face grim with determination. "Dr. Morton, step away from her." Morton looked between them, understanding flooding his features. "You've been listening." "The office is wired," Mike confirmed. "Has been for years. Judge Whitmore likes to know what conversations are happening in sensitive locations." Gwen felt the trap closing around her. "How long have you known I was here?" "Long enough." Mike stepped into the office, his presence filling the space with menace. "Long enough to hear Dr. Morton make some very serious accusations about respected members of this community." "Accusations?" Morton's voice cracked. "I was confessing to murder, you bastard." "You were having a breakdown brought on by grief and alcohol," Mike corrected smoothly. "A tragic case of a dedicated physician pushed beyond his limits by years of treating terminal patients." His eyes fixed on Gwen. "Unfortunately, this breakdown has been triggered by the daughter of a patient who's been experiencing her own psychological difficulties since her father's death. The story was being written in real time. Dr. Morton would have a convenient breakdown, possibly requiring hospitalization. Gwen would be found having suffered a tragic accident, overcome by grief and conspiracy theories. The evidence would disappear, and Millbrook's secrets would remain buried." "Tommy knows I'm here?" Gwen said, hoping it was true. Mike smiled coldly. "Tommy Walsh is currently being evaluated for emergency psychiatric commitment. Seems his brain damage has finally progressed to the point where he's become a danger to himself and others." The net was closing. Tommy had been neutralized, Dr. Morton was about to be silenced permanently, and she was trapped in an office with a man who'd already helped murder at least 7 people. But as Mike moved closer, his confidence in controlling the situation, Gwen noticed something he'd missed in his rush to contain the crisis. Dr. Morton's phone lay on the desk, its screen glowing with an active call. The entire conversation had been recorded and transmitted to someone outside the office. Morton caught her glance and smiled for the first time in years, a genuine expression that transformed his guilt-ravaged features into something approaching peace. 25 years too late," he said quietly, "but I finally kept my oath to do no harm." Mike lunged for the phone, but Morton was faster. With the desperate strength of a man who'd found redemption at the cost of his life, he swept the device off the desk and hurled it through the office window. The glass shattered with a sound like breaking chains, and as the phone tumbled into the street below, Dr. James Morton smiled one last time before Mike Harrison's bullet ended 30 years of living with the weight of blood on his hands. The war for truth had claimed its first casualty, but the battle was far from over. The sound of Dr. Morton's body hitting the floor echoed in Gwen's ears as Mike Harrison turned his weapon toward her. His face had transformed from the charming boy she'd once known into something cold and calculating, the expression of a man who'd killed before and felt nothing about killing again. "That was unfortunate," Mike said, his voice steady despite having just murdered a man in cold blood. "Dr. Morton's been unstable for years. Everyone in town knew he had a drinking problem, guilt over patients he couldn't save. Today, he finally snapped. "You can't make this look like suicide," Gwen said, backing toward the office window. "Not with me here as a witness." Mike's smile was genuinely sad. "No, you're going to be another victim of his breakdown. He shot you first, then himself." A tragic end to a man destroyed by the pressure of small-town medicine and a grieving daughter's conspiracy theories. Through the shattered window, Gwen could see Morton's phone lying in the street below, its screen cracked but still glowing. She had to believe the transmission had gone through, that somewhere beyond Millbrook's borders, someone was listening to the recording of Morton's confession. "The phone transmitted everything," she said. "State police will have heard Morton's confession by now." Morton's phone called his answering service. Mike replied calmly. "Standard protocol when he's having a mental health crisis. The recording will show a disturbed man making wild accusations under the influence of alcohol and grief. Nothing more." The lie was delivered with such practiced ease that Gwen realized this wasn't improvisation. They'd planned for this contingency. Every angle had been covered, every potential witness accounted for. Except one. What about Tommy? Tommy Walsh is currently sedated in the county psychiatric facility, being treated for a psychotic break. By the time he's coherent enough to speak, this will all be over. Mike gestured with his gun toward Morton's body. "Sit down in the chair, Gwen. Let's make this look right." She remained standing, her mind racing through options. The office had only one door, and Mike was blocking it. The window was 2 stories up. Jumping would likely be fatal. But staying meant certain death. "You know what's funny?" she said, buying time. "My father spent 20 years being afraid of you people. 20 years living in terror, keeping his evidence hidden, too scared to act. But he was wrong about one thing." "What's that?" "He thought you were untouchable. He thought the conspiracy was too big, too powerful to fight." Gwen smiled, surprising herself with how calm she felt facing her own death. "But you're not untouchable. You're desperate. You're making mistakes." Mike's confidence flickered. "What mistakes?" "Killing Dr. Morton in his own office. Having me here when it happened. Acting without Judge Whitmore's approval." She saw uncertainty cross his features. "She doesn't know you're here, does she?" "I'm cleaning up a mess before it spreads." "You're creating a bigger mess. Morton's confession is out there now. Even if you kill me, even if you discredit Tommy, the truth is beyond your control." Mike raised his weapon, finger tightening on the trigger. "Maybe. But you won't be alive to see it." The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the confined space, but Gwen felt no impact. She opened eyes she didn't remember closing to see Mike Harrison stumbling backward, clutching his shoulder, his gun clattering to the floor. In the doorway stood Emma Harrison, her face pale but determined, a smoking revolver in her hands. "I'm sorry," Emma said, and Gwen wasn't sure if she was apologizing to her husband or to her. "Emma." Mike's voice was filled with shock and betrayal. "What are you doing?" "What I should have done 20 years ago." Emma kept the gun trained on her husband, though her hands shook with the effort. "I heard Morton's confession through the surveillance feed. I heard everything. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Emma's voice broke. "I've understood for years. The expensive house, the luxury cars, the vacation we could never afford on a detective's salary. I knew where the money was coming from. I just told myself it didn't matter. Mike pressed his hand against his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. Everything I did was for us. For our family. You murdered people, Mike. You murdered Gwen's mother. Emma's tears were flowing freely now. You murdered people and I stayed silent because I was comfortable with the benefits. Emma, please. No. Her voice grew stronger. 20 years of silence is enough. Gwen moved carefully toward Mike's fallen weapon, keeping her eyes on both of them. The situation was volatile. A woman who'd just shot her husband might be capable of anything. Emma, Gwen said gently, what changed? Why now? Because I have children. Emma's voice cracked. A daughter who's 15 now, the same age you were when your mother died. And yesterday, she started asking questions about a history project. Questions about local government, about development projects, about why some people in Millbrook live so much better than others. The confession hit Gwen like a revelation. Emma hadn't just been living with guilt. She'd been living with terror that her own daughter might stumble onto the same dangerous truths that had gotten Maggie Evans killed. She deserves better than this, Emma continued. She deserves to grow up in a world where truth matters, where justice exists, not in a place where asking the wrong questions gets you murdered. Mike struggled to his feet, his face contorted with pain and rage. You're destroying everything we built. We built it on blood, Mike, on the bodies of innocent people who wanted to do the right thing. Emma's gun never wavered. I won't let our daughter inherit that legacy. Judge Whitmore will never let this stand, Mike said desperately. You know what she's capable of. You know what happens to people who betray the family. Then maybe it's time someone stood up to her. Emma looked at Gwen. My brother Tommy is sedated, but not dead. Dr. Morton's confession is recorded. Between his testimony, Tommy's evidence, and what I know about the financial arrangements, we can destroy this conspiracy. Emma, think about what you're saying. I've been thinking about it for 20 years. Emma's voice was steady now, filled with a resolve that reminded Gwen of her mother. I'm done being afraid. I'm done being complicit. I'm done letting evil prosper because it's easier than fighting it. Mike lunged toward his fallen gun, but his wounded shoulder slowed him. Gwen reached it first, pointing the weapon at the man who'd helped orchestrate her mother's murder. It's over, Mike. It's never over. Blood loss was making him pale, but his voice remained defiant. You don't understand how deep this goes. Whitmore has connections at the state level, federal level. You think one confession from a drunk doctor is going to bring down a network that's been operating for decades? Maybe not, Gwen admitted, but it's a start. In the distance, sirens wailed, real sirens, not the local police who'd covered up murders for 20 years. Emma had made more than one phone call before coming to save her. State police, Emma confirmed. They should have received Dr. Morton's transmission by now. And my own statement about the conspiracy. Mike's face went gray as the reality of his situation sank in. 20 years of carefully constructed lies were unraveling in a single afternoon. You know what the worst part is? Gwen said, looking down at the man who'd destroyed so many lives. My father was right about everything. Every paranoid suspicion, every conspiracy theory, every warning about trusting people in this town. He was right, and I spent 14 years thinking he was crazy. The sirens were getting closer now. Soon, Millbrook would be swarming with investigators who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or silenced. The conspiracy that had murdered Maggie Evans and at least 6 others was finally going to face justice. But as Gwen looked out the window at the town that had shaped her childhood, she knew the price of truth was always higher than anyone expected. Lives would be destroyed, families torn apart, a community's faith in itself shattered beyond repair. Sometimes the cost of justice was almost as terrible as the cost of silence. Almost 6 months after Dr. Morton's murder and Emma Harrison's betrayal of the conspiracy, Millbrook resembled a town under siege. Media vans lined Main Street like metallic vultures, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray November skies. Federal investigators had transformed the courthouse into a fortress of evidence boxes and testimony transcripts. The quiet community that had once prided itself on keeping secrets had become a national symbol of corruption exposed. Gwen stood at the window of her hotel room. She'd moved out of Bobby's house after the third break-in attempt, watching reporters interview anyone willing to speak on camera. Most townspeople hurried past with their heads down, unwilling to acknowledge the cameras that had turned their private shame into public spectacle. The trials had been swift and devastating. Judge Patricia Whitmore, facing federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and corruption, had maintained her dignity, even as the evidence mounted against her. Her conviction 2 weeks earlier had been front-page news across the state, but for Gwen, it had felt strangely hollow. Justice delivered by strangers in a courtroom couldn't resurrect the dead or restore the years of grief her father had endured alone. Mike Harrison had cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, his testimony revealing the conspiracy's connections to state-level officials and other development projects across 3 counties. But his cooperation had come at a price. Emma's marriage was destroyed, her children subjected to the public humiliation of having their father exposed as a murderer. The family had moved away from Millbrook, seeking anonymity in a distant city where no one knew their history. Tommy Walsh had recovered from his forced sedation and become the prosecution's star witness, his 20 years of careful documentation providing the backbone of the federal case. But the revelation of his deception, the years of pretending to be brain-damaged while secretly gathering evidence, had left him isolated even among those who supported his courage. Trust, once broken in a small town, was almost impossible to repair. Knock, knock. The voice from her doorway belonged to Assistant District Attorney Sarah Chen, the state prosecutor who'd led the federal investigation. They'd formed an unlikely friendship during the months of testimony and depositions, bonded by their shared pursuit of justice and their mutual understanding of the price it demanded. "Any word on the Peterson case?" Gwen asked, not turning from the window. Sarah entered the room, her briefcase heavy with files from related investigations. Conviction: 25 to life for the murder of David Rodriguez in 2018. That makes 7 convictions directly related to your mother's case, with 3 more trials pending. 7 convictions. 7 lives destroyed by the pursuit of justice her mother had died trying to achieve. Gwen felt no satisfaction in the number, only a weary recognition that justice was messier and more painful than she'd ever imagined. "How's the town handling it?" Sarah asked, joining her at the window. Below them, Millbrook's Main Street told the story of a community in collapse. Henderson's Hardware displayed a going-out-of-business sign. Murphy's Diner had closed permanently after the owner was implicated in laundering money for the conspiracy. The historic district that Maggie Evans had died trying to protect was now empty storefronts and for sale signs, the irony bitter in its completeness. "About as well as you'd expect," Gwen replied. "Tourism is gone, businesses are failing, property values have collapsed. Half the town council resigned in shame, and the other half is under federal investigation. The community college is talking about closing the Millbrook campus. Innocent people always suffer when systematic corruption is exposed," Sarah said gently. "It's one of the tragic realities of seeking justice. But the alternative, allowing the murders to continue, would have been worse." Gwen knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't ease the guilt she felt watching a town die because she'd insisted on pursuing the truth. The residents who'd had nothing to do with the conspiracy were paying the price for their leaders' crimes, their livelihoods destroyed by association with Millbrook's toxic reputation. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked. The question hung in the air like morning mist. Gwen thought about her father, about the 20 years he'd spent knowing the truth but choosing silence to protect her. She thought about Emma Harrison, now divorced and struggling to rebuild her life while protecting her children from the consequences of her husband's crimes. She thought about Tommy Walsh, vindicated but alone, trusted by no one despite his courage. "Every day," she admitted, "but not about exposing the truth. About not believing my father sooner. About not being brave enough to help him 20 years ago. You were a child. I was old enough to listen, old enough to trust the man who raised me instead of dismissing him as paranoid." Gwen finally turned from the window. "He died, thinking I believed he was crazy." He also died, knowing he'd left you the evidence to finish what he started. That's not the action of a man who'd given up hope. A soft knock interrupted their conversation. Tommy Walsh stood in the doorway, looking older than his 35 years but cleaner and more alert than he'd appeared in decades. Sobriety and the end of his deception had given him a dignity that the harmless drunk persona had hidden. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "I wanted to say goodbye before you leave." Gwen had made the decision to return to the city permanently, selling Bobby's house and severing her last ties to Millbrook. The forensic accounting firm where she worked had offered her a partnership, partly in recognition of her investigative skills, and partly as positive publicity from her role in exposing the conspiracy. "Sit," she said, grateful for his company despite the complicated emotions his presence evoked. Tommy settled into a chair, his movements careful and deliberate, habits developed during 20 years of maintaining a character. "Any word on the federal investigation into the state connections?" Sarah nodded. 3 state officials indicted last week. The governor's office is cooperating fully, but there's evidence the corruption network extends into other municipalities. Your documentation is helping us identify patterns across multiple jurisdictions. Good. Tommy's satisfaction was evident. Maybe some good will come from all this destruction. The town doesn't see it that way, Gwen observed. The town chose to look the other way for decades, Tommy replied, his voice harder than she'd ever heard it. People knew things weren't right. They saw the unexplained wealth, the convenient accidents, the way certain questions were discouraged. They chose comfort over curiosity. Not everyone knew. No, but enough did. Enough to create a culture where asking difficult questions was seen as rocking the boat, where going along was easier than standing up. Tommy leaned forward. "Your mother died because she refused to go along. My girlfriend died in that teenage accident because she was asking questions about who was selling drugs to high school kids, questions that threatened people with connections to Judge Whitmore's network." This was news to Gwen. "Your accident wasn't an accident. The brain damage was real. That part wasn't planned. But the crash that caused it? Someone tampered with my girlfriend's car because she was getting too close to exposing the drug operation that helped fund the judge's early political campaigns." Tommy's hands clenched. "I spent 20 years planning revenge while everyone pitied the poor brain-damaged boy." The scope of the conspiracy's violence was still expanding, even months after its exposure. Each investigation revealed new victims, new crimes, new layers of systematic corruption that had infected every aspect of Millbrook's civic life. "Do you think it was worth it?" Gwen asked. "All the destruction, all the pain we've caused to innocent people?" Tommy was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dying town below. "Ask me in 10 years, he said finally, "when we see what grows in the ruins. When we know if the children who grow up here have a chance at something better than what we inherited." Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming message. She checked it and smiled grimly. "The federal task force wants to meet with both of you next week. They're expanding the investigation into 3 more counties, and they need your expertise to identify similar patterns." The work was continuing. The network that had killed Maggie Evans had been larger than any of them had imagined, its tentacles reaching into communities across the region. Justice for one murder had uncovered evidence of dozens more, creating a domino effect that would take years to fully resolve. "Will you do it?" Sarah asked. Gwen looked at Tommy, seeing her own exhaustion reflected in his eyes. They'd won their fight for justice, but victory felt more like survival than triumph. The cost had been higher than either of them had anticipated, not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. But in her mind, she heard Bobby's voice from that final night. Trust no one, except he'd been wrong about that too. She'd learned to trust Tommy, to trust Sarah, to trust the possibility that exposing evil was worth the price it demanded. "Yes," she said, "we'll do it." Outside, Millbrook continued its slow death, a community destroyed by the revelation of its own corruption. But somewhere beyond its borders, other communities might be spared the same fate, because 2 people had chosen truth over comfort, justice over peace. It wasn't the ending Gwen had imagined when she'd first discovered Bobby's evidence. It wasn't clean or satisfying or redemptive in the ways she'd hoped, but it was honest. And after 20 years of lies, honesty was its own form of justice. 1 year later, Gwen stood at her mother's grave for the first time since returning to Millbrook. The headstone was simple granite, bearing only Maggie Evans's name and dates. No flowery epitaph about beloved wife and mother, no mention of the community activism that had cost her life. Bobby had chosen stark simplicity, perhaps knowing that the truth about her death was too complex for engraving in stone. The flowers Gwen placed were autumn chrysanthemums, her mother's favorites. Yellow and bronze blooms that had filled their garden every October, creating a riot of color that Maggie had called nature's final celebration before winter's sleep. "I finished what you started," Gwen said quietly, her words carried away by November wind. "It wasn't pretty, and it cost more than I thought it would, but the truth is out there now." The cemetery was empty, except for her and the groundskeeper working quietly among distant headstones. Millbrook had stabilized somewhat over the past year. New businesses had moved into some of the empty storefronts, attracted by cheap rent and the town's newfound notoriety as a symbol of corruption exposed. A small college had established a satellite campus specializing in criminal justice studies, drawing students interested in studying the anatomy of systematic corruption. Tommy Walsh had written a book about his 20-year deception, titled Invisible Witness. It had become a bestseller, bringing unwanted attention but also providing him with financial security for the first time in his adult life. He'd moved to a small farm outside town, seeking privacy while remaining available to assist with ongoing federal investigations. Emma Harrison had returned to Millbrook 2 months earlier, divorced and using her maiden name. She'd opened a victim advocacy center in one of the renovated downtown buildings, helping people in other communities who were struggling to expose corruption or seeking justice for crimes the local authorities had ignored. Her work was quietly funded by the proceeds from the book deals and speaking engagements that had followed the conspiracy's exposure. The Margaret Evans Foundation, which Gwen had established using her father's estate and a portion of her book advance, was beginning its second year of operation. The foundation provided legal and financial support to whistleblowers and corruption victims, filling a gap that Gwen had discovered during her own journey toward justice. "I think you'd be proud of what's growing from all this," Gwen continued, adjusting the flowers against the headstone. "It's not the Millbrook you knew, but maybe it's the one you were trying to create." A shadow fell across the grave. Gwen looked up to see an older woman approaching, someone she didn't recognize but who carried herself with the careful dignity of a long-time resident. "You're Maggie's daughter," the woman said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. I'm Helen Rodriguez. David was my son." The name hit Gwen with recognition. David Rodriguez had been one of the conspiracy's victims, murdered for investigating environmental permit irregularities. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For giving me answers. For 20 years, I knew something was wrong about David's death, but I didn't have your father's resources or your skills. I grieved without closure, wondered without resolution." Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Because of you, I finally know what happened to my boy." They stood together in the quiet cemetery, two women connected by loss and the pursuit of truth. Helen placed her own flowers, white roses, on a nearby grave marked with her son's name. "Do you ever regret it?" Helen asked. "Exposing everything, even though it destroyed so much?" Gwen considered the question she'd asked herself countless times. "I regret the pain it caused innocent people. I regret not believing my father sooner. But I don't regret the truth." "Good." Helen's voice was firm. "The truth is what they feared most. That's why they killed our children, to keep it buried. The fact that it finally came to light means they didn't win." After Helen left, Gwen remained at the graveside as afternoon shadows lengthened. She'd come to Millbrook expecting to find closure for a difficult relationship with her dying father. Instead, she'd uncovered a legacy of courage and determination that had shaped her understanding of justice, responsibility, and the price of moral compromise. "I understand now why you kept investigating," she said to Bobby's grave, marked by a headstone 30 feet away. "And I understand why you let me go. You were protecting me the only way you knew how." The wind picked up, sending dead leaves skittering across the cemetery paths. Winter was coming to Millbrook, but it would be followed by spring, a season of renewal that the town was already beginning to experience. Gwen gathered her things and walked toward her car, carrying with her the weight of memory and the burden of truth. Tomorrow, she would return to the city and the life she'd built there. But she would also continue the work her parents had begun, fighting corruption, supporting victims, and ensuring that their deaths had meaning beyond the pain they'd caused. The secrets were finally free, and in their wake, something new was growing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Quote,